In this lecture, we're going to continue on with the nervous system, and we're going to focus on a very important type of cell called the neuroglial cells, or just glial cells for short. So if you remember back to the tissue unit, nervous tissue actually is made up of two different types of cells. There's the neurons, which are the stars of the show, right? Everybody thinks of the neuron as being the nervous system, and that's pretty accurate. That's the actual cell that sends information. So in terms of what's the most important type of cell in a neuron, nervous tissue, you could say it's a neuron, but the neuroglial cells are also extremely important because when they're not there, the neurons don't work. So these are the support cells which allow the neurons to do their job. And actually, they're about equal in number in the brain. So the brain is made up of about half neurons, half neuroglial cells. So that just gives you an indication of how important these cells are because they're so abundant. Well, most of, your brain has a lot of fat in there, actually. There's a lot of fat in your brain, and that's because of the myelin sheath that I talked about. That's all fatty material. But in terms of the cells, you're going to have neuroglial cells and neurons. So let's get started talking about our glial cells. They are important support tissue that have a bunch of different jobs. And there's 4 different types of glial cells, and they have, major jobs that they do. Let's get started with the first type. So the astrocytes are the first type of glial cells, and astro means star, and that's appropriately named because they are star-shaped. So if you take a look down here, this little image demonstrates the role of astrocytes. So if you take a look over here, you can see these are the neurons, right? There's the multipolar neurons. You can see all those little dendrites coming off of the cell body, and then you have the axon, and that's going to be synapsing with another neuron. And then this would be a blood vessel, and then these are the astrocytes. So the astrocytes are really found between the blood vessel and the neuron. Let's think about what the energy demand on a neuron is. A neuron is a cell, right? And cells have a high energy demand, especially if they use a lot of energy to make proteins and do a job. And neurons use a massive amount of ATP. Every time they fire off, they're using huge amounts of ATP to send that impulse down the axon and also to create new proteins to send information from one to the next. So our energy demand is extremely high with our neurons. And that's why you probably noticed before, if you study a lot or if you spend a lot of time reading, you get hungry. That's because your brain's screaming out for more energy. So what does your cells need? What do the cells need in order to function? They need sugar, they need oxygen, they need amino acids. So what is the job of the astrocyte? Well, the astrocyte connects from the blood vessel to the neuron. Now, we don't fully know everything that they do, but we do know that there's some form of communication going on. Now, remember, it's chemical communication. They're not talking to each other. They're sending chemical signals, and that triggers different things to happen inside the body. So we know that astrocytes are important because they need to be there to make this happen. And one of their big jobs is they actually transport glucose from the blood vessel into the neuron. And actually, our astrocytes store glycogen, so that way if there's low blood sugar, the glycogen in the astrocyte can be used to give to the neuron to continue to make more energy. So really important for transporting glucose and glycogen, important for support. It holds everything together. Think of the astrocytes as glue holding together the brain tissue. And also, they have the important job of separating neurons from each other. Remember, neurons are sending electrical information. If you've ever heard the term crossing wires before, that's like if you have 2 electrical wires crossing each other, they're going to interrupt each other's signal, right? Well, if neurons are crossing each other, that can cause a problem as well. So it keeps these neurons separate from each other and keeps the different brain areas kind of designated for what they're responsible for. So astrocytes are extremely important. They are found in between the blood vessels and the neurons. They are responsible for communication between the blood and the neurons, but most importantly, as far as we know they do things that we don't understand yet, but as far as we know, they also store glycogen and glucose so that these neurons can function. The next type of neuroglial cell is going to be a microglial cell. Micro means small, and glia refers to glial cells, right? And these are really important. They're like the cleanup crew. our brains produce a lot of waste. There's a lot of theories as to why we sleep, and we still don't. I'm going to teach you about sleep in the next unit, in the brain unit, and we still really don't understand what's happening when somebody sleeps. But what we do know is you need sleep, right? We know we need it. If you don't get it, you feel like garbage the next day. And one of the big theories is that when you sleep, it gives your brain a chance to get rid of all this metabolic waste that builds up. So what's getting rid of that waste? Are microglial cells. So these little guys here, they look like astrocytes, right? They are very similar. They have these projections coming off. They have these processes, and they really are there to destroy and break down any waste that's produced, any dead cells, anything that doesn't belong, or any harmful substances. So our brain is really hard to get into in terms of toxins. We have this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which we're going to talk more about when we get to the circulatory system, when we get to the blood unit. But the blood-brain barrier really prevents things from getting into the brain, which is good. We want our brain to be kept away from toxins. But sometimes things do get into the brain tissue, and that's what the microglia do. They get basically sent into action to get rid of things that don't belong or to destroy old cell parts. So if you look at this image here, this is a dead cell. That is being produced, and there's a chemical messenger that tells that resting microglia to go into fight mode, and it goes and it destroys this dead cell material and cleans it up. So think of the microglia as the cleanup crew, and they phagocytize anything that doesn't belong. This next type is called an oligodendrocyte. And oligodendrocytes are also similar to astrocytes because they have projections as well, but they're not as many processes. And what they do is extremely important. They produce the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. And this is an important detail, so I'm going to say this, so please make sure you're paying attention. You'll see I scrawled on here in marker, Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. So the Schwann cells, if you remember, they make up this thing called the myelin sheath that insulates the neuron axon and allows the impulse to travel down the neuron. That is in the peripheral nervous system, so everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. However, in the brain and spinal cord, everything's packed in so tight, there's actually these specialized cells called oligodendrocytes, and they have these extensions, and those extensions actually branch off and they wrap around the axon, and they produce the myelin sheath. And they also hold the tissue together. So the oligodendrocytes are really important for producing the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, and also they are responsible for kind of keeping these neurons packed in tightly. And so you can think of the oligodendrocytes as being like a glue holding together the brain tissue. So this is the node of Ranvier here. This is our myelin sheath, and you can see this is our oligodendrocyte with branching extensions wrapping around the axon, causing the myelin sheath. So in terms of what you need to know, make sure you know that the myelin sheath is produced by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, and it's produced by oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. They both do the same thing, it's just they're different types of cells that do it. And finally, the last type of neuroglial cell that we're going to talk about is going to be our little ependymal cells. So ependymal cells are the cells that make up the membrane of the brain tissue. This is epithelial tissue. This is going to be epithelial tissue. So they're columnar and cuboidal shaped cells, and they form the inner lining of the brain tissue. So what we're seeing here is a cross section of the brain. In the brain, there are actually open areas called ventricles, and those ventricles they're not empty space though. They're full of something called cerebral spinal fluid. You may have heard of cerebral spinal fluid before. If you've ever heard of a spinal tap, what they're doing is they're going into the vertebral column and they're going into the spinal cord, and they're actually pulling out some cerebral spinal fluid. Well, where does that CSF come from? It comes from these ependymal cells. So these little ependymal cells, they line the boundary of these ventricles. So this would be in the brain. This would be brain tissue here. This would be brain tissue here. And what they do is they would fill up this space with cerebral spinal fluid, and that cerebral spinal fluid would flow down the spinal cord and back up and around the brain. And we're going to talk all about that in the next unit on the central nervous system. But for now, you just need to know that the ependymal cells, they are the membrane of the brain. They form the inner membrane of the ventricles, and they're responsible for allowing diffusion to occur, and they also produce cerebral spinal fluid. So they produce the cerebral spinal fluid that fills up the space. So in this last diagram here, you can really see those 4 types of neuroglial cells. This is a neuron here. So this represents a neuron. That's the cell body. These are the dendrites. This is the axon. This is your astrocyte connecting to the blood vessel, to the cell body, and that is going to be basically communicating between the blood vessel and the neuron, and it's going to be storing glucose and glycogen for use later. Down here we have our ependymal cells, which are going to be basically filling up this space here with cerebral spinal fluid. So this is going to be your membrane right here. We have our oligodendrocytes over here, which are making the myelin sheath around the axon. So you can see these are 2 different neurons that are being held together by these oligodendrocytes. And then finally we have these microglial cells, which are kind of just hanging around waiting to get called into action to break down and destroy anything that does not belong. They phagocytize dead cell parts and also any toxins or unwanted particles that may have made their way through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain tissue. Thank you very much.